New York, Harlem, 1971. A cop slapped Frank Lucas's mother in front of 40 people on a Tuesday morning. Frank Lucas was across the street when it happened. He saw everything. 72 hours later, Detective Raymond Caruso was found naked, alone, sitting in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge at 3 in the morning, repeating his own name out loud as if he had forgotten who he was. No gun, no badge, no wallet, no explanation for how he got there or what had happened in the last 3 days. He never returned to police duty. He never gave a coherent explanation for those 72 hours. But to understand what happened between that Tuesday morning and Friday's early hours, you first need to understand who Raymond Caruso was, and what he had miscalculated so completely that the mistake cost him everything he had. Caruso was 43 years old in 1971, 18 years with the New York Police Department, second-grade detective, which on paper meant investigations, and in practice meant systematic and well-organized extortion in a territory he had mentally divided into collection zones, the way a mail carrier divides routes. Each zone had its rhythm. Each business had its value. Every person operating outside the law in that territory had their monthly price to keep operating without disturbance. It was an efficient system. It had worked for 11 years without significant interruption. The problem with efficient systems built on intimidation is that they create in their architects a confidence that, over time, turns into carelessness. Caruso had extorted, threatened, and humiliated so many people for so long, without consequence, that he had reached a silent and fatal conclusion, that he had become untouchable. That the badge, the 11 years of the system he had built, and the network of protection within the department made him immune to any response that didn't come from within the police structure itself. That conclusion was reasonable based on historical evidence. But there was one variable Caruso had systematically underestimated. Frank Lucas had been paying Caruso for 3 years. Not because he needed protection in the conventional sense, because Frank had learned early on that corrupt cops are tools that need to be kept calibrated. You pay, you keep the channel open, and you use that channel when you need information or space to operate without unnecessary friction. It was a cold, mutually understood transactional relationship. Caruso had interpreted that relationship differently. He had interpreted it as submission, as confirmation that Frank Lucas, like everyone else in the territory, paid because Caruso had power over him. That interpretation was the mistake. Frank didn't pay because Caruso had power over him. Frank paid because it was the most efficient cost to keep a variable controlled in an environment full of variables. The distinction between those two interpretations is enormous, and it was that distinction that Caruso revealed he didn't understand on a Tuesday morning in October 1971. Frank Lucas's mother was named Mayha Lee, 68 years old. She had come from North Carolina to visit her son 3 weeks earlier, as she did twice a year. A small woman, white hair, who walked with the specific dignity of someone who had lived a long time and learned to carry the weight of life without fully bending. Frank adored her with an intensity few around him had ever seen, because Frank rarely showed what he adored. For obvious security reasons in a world where what you love becomes leverage in the hands of enemies. Mahali was in a grocery store on 119th Street that Tuesday morning, buying the things she liked to buy when visiting her son. No hurry, no intention beyond a quiet morning of shopping before heading back to the apartment. Caruso entered the grocery store with 2 uniformed officers. Routine extortion operation, the kind he did regularly. Show up, put pressure on the owner, collect the monthly payment with the performance of authority he had perfected over 18 years. Mahali was in the way when Caruso moved toward the owner. She wasn't intentionally blocking. She was simply present in the space. A white-haired lady with a shopping bag in a neighborhood grocery in the wrong place at the moment. Caruso had decided nothing and no one should be in his path. Caruso told her to move. Mahali moved, but not fast enough for the rhythm Caruso had mentally set for that morning. He slapped her with an open hand. Not a push, a slap. Hard enough to make Mahali lose her balance and grab the nearest shelf to keep from falling. The shopping bag dropped. Some items rolled across the floor. The 2 uniformed officers stood still, looking the other way with the expertise of those who had learned not to see what wasn't convenient to see. 40 people in the grocery store and on the sidewalk outside watched. Frank Lucas was across the street. He had left the apartment earlier that morning for reasons he could never fully explain afterward. Intuition. The kind of antenna that 20 years in a dangerous business develops as a survival mechanism. He was crossing the street toward the grocery store when he saw through the window what was happening. He saw the exact moment of impact. He saw his mother grab the shelf. He saw the bag fall. What happened inside Frank Lucas at that moment is impossible to describe, precisely because Frank never described it. But what the people who were with him that morning described afterward was a transformation in his expression that they had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Anger was familiar in that environment. It was something else. Colder, deeper, the kind of thing that has no proper name, but that everyone recognizes when they see it because it makes the air temperature around it feel different. Frank didn't enter the grocery store, he stayed outside, standing. For how long, no one could measure precisely. Then he turned and walked away. No words, no gesture, no visible reaction beyond the pause. Caruso left the grocery store 10 minutes later with the monthly envelope in his pocket, without giving any further attention to the woman he had knocked down or the 40 people who had watched. He got in the car with the two uniformed officers and left. To him, it had been a routine Tuesday morning. That assessment lasted less than an hour. Because within an hour, 3 different people had found a way to let Caruso know that the lady in the grocery store was Mahalie Lucas, Frank Lucas's mother. That Frank had been across the street, that he had seen everything. Caruso processed that information and made a decision that revealed the size of the misjudgment he had made about the nature of his relationship with Frank. He decided there was no problem. His reasoning was as follows. Frank paid. Frank needed the protection of the scheme to operate. Frank couldn't afford to create trouble with the police structure that protected his operations. Therefore, Frank would swallow it. Maybe there would be an uncomfortable conversation. Maybe the monthly payment would increase as informal compensation. But in the end, the math of dependency would work as it always had. It was coherent reasoning, based on a completely wrong premise about who Frank Lucas was and what his mother represented in the emotional architecture of a man who had built an entire life keeping calculated distance from anything that could be used against him. Mahalie was not a variable in that architecture. She was the exception to all the rules Frank had built. Frank went home after leaving the sidewalk. He stayed in the apartment for 2 hours without speaking to anyone. Then he started making calls. Not calls about Caruso specifically, mapping calls. The kind Frank made when he needed to fully understand the terrain before moving. Where Caruso lived, who he lived with, what his routine was outside of work, who the people were who mattered to him in the same way Mahalie mattered to Frank. Because Frank had learned one fundamental thing over 20 years. You don't destroy a man by attacking what he has built. You destroy a man by removing what he believes protects him. And what Caruso believed protected him was the conviction that he was untouchable, that the system he had built around himself, the department, the network of protection, the years of traded favors, formed an impermeable armor. Frank spent the first 24 hours not acting, mapping. What the mapping revealed was this: Caruso had 3 critical dependencies that sustained his conviction of untouchability. The first was informational. There was a sergeant inside the department who functioned as an early warning system, tipping Caruso off in advance about any internal investigation that might get close. The second was financial. The extortion money passed through 2 front businesses before becoming legitimate income on paper. The third was personal. Caruso had a second family that no one in the department knew existed. A woman and 2 children in an apartment in Queens that represented everything he had built outside his official life. Each of those dependencies was a lever. Frank didn't need to use force on any of them. On the morning of the second day, the sergeant who served as Caruso's early warning system received anonymous and extremely detailed information about his own illegal activities, arriving simultaneously at 3 different destinations within the department. The information was accurate, verifiable, and specific enough to make any protection the sergeant could offer Caruso a luxury he simply could no longer afford. The warning system shut down in hours. In the afternoon of the second day, the 2 front businesses that processed Caruso's money received visits from tax inspectors with extraordinarily detailed documentation of specific irregularities requiring immediate investigation. Neither visit had any visible connection to anything. They appeared to be routine procedures amplified by anonymous tips. The owners of the businesses, who maintained the arrangement with Caruso for their own convenience and not out of loyalty, calculated the risks in less than an hour and made obvious self-preservation decisions. The financial flow stopped. On the night of the second day, the woman in Queens received an envelope. Inside were photographs and documents sufficient for her to clearly understand the full nature of the life the man she lived with had built over 18 years. There was no threat in the envelope, no instructions, just information. What she did with that information was entirely her decision. She called Caruso at 11 o'clock at night. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. What was said in that conversation, no one knows precisely. But what Caruso was after that call was fundamentally different from what he had been before it. Because in less than 48 hours, the three pillars sustaining his conviction of untouchability had been silently removed one by one, without any individual action seeming connected to the others, without there being a face or a name to attack in response. Caruso spent the next day trying to identify where the pressure was coming from. He couldn't, because the pressure wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from everywhere at once, from inside the department, from the front businesses, from home, from the only person he had kept separate from the life his colleagues knew. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you squeezed, the more escaped through more places. In the early hours of Friday, 72 hours after slapping a white-haired lady in a grocery store on 119th Street, Raymond Caruso was found sitting in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge, naked, repeating his own name, with the look of someone who had stared into the void where he believed there was solidity and couldn't process what he saw. The subsequent investigation never found evidence of any crime committed against Caruso in those 72 hours. No physical violence, no kidnapping, no documentable threat. Just a sequence of events that individually would be coincidence and together were something else entirely. But something no investigator could name precisely enough to lead anywhere. Caruso never returned to active duty. He never gave an interview. He never explained what had happened in those 72 hours, or what he had thought sitting in the middle of a bridge at 3 in the morning, without clothes and without a functional name inside his own head. Frank Lucas never commented on the matter. He never confirmed involvement, never denied it. When Caruso's name came up in conversations, Frank changed the subject with the naturalness of someone changing the channel on a television. There was no victory narrative, no story to tell. There was only the result and the silence around the result. And here is what that silence carries within it, going far beyond Frank Lucas and Raymond Caruso. Caruso had made a mistake that men with institutional power make with disturbing frequency. He had confused the absence of visible response with the absence of the capacity to respond. He had interpreted Frank's monthly payment as evidence of dependency when it was evidence of strategy. He had believed the armor he had built around himself was impermeable because he had never encountered force strong enough to truly test it. The problem wasn't the armor. It was that Frank hadn't attacked the armor. He had removed the ground beneath the man wearing it. And when the ground disappears, the heaviest armor in the world becomes just additional weight pulling downward. The lesson here isn't about revenge. It isn't about what to do when someone hurts what you love. It's about the difference between reaction and response. Reaction happens on the adversary's time with the emotions the adversary planted, on the terrain the adversary chose. Response happens on your own time, with the clarity that only patience allows, on the terrain you chose after fully mapping what needs to be mapped. Frank Lucas saw his mother get hit on a Tuesday morning and walked away without saying a word. 72 hours later, the problem had unraveled from the inside. Not because Frank was more violent, because Frank understood that real power is never where it appears to be. It's in the invisible dependencies that sustain the conviction that power exists. Remove those dependencies with sufficient precision, and the power disappears on its own without you needing to touch anything directly. Caruso woke up on a bridge unable to remember his own name, and Frank Lucas had breakfast with his mother that Friday morning without mentioning the matter once.